They locked her in that barn on the coldest night of January 1861. Her own father drove the bolt through the door and wrapped the chains around the handles like she was something rabid, something cursed. Colonel James Whitmore stood in the frozen Kentucky mud, his breath rising in pale clouds, and he said to the men watching, "God's judgment is upon this house. Let no one speak her name again." Eleanor was 19 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant with the child of a man they pulled from the Kentucky River 3 weeks before. Drowned, they said, though the back of his skull told a different story. I need you to understand something before this goes any further. The story you've heard, the one they still whisper in Lexington when the wind comes down through the valley, it's not the whole truth, but it's not a lie either. Legends don't come from nowhere. They come from what people can't say out loud, from what gets buried so deep it starts to grow roots. And what happened that winter on the Whitmore estate? It grew roots so thick they choked the ground for generations. The Whitmore family owned 300 acres of tobacco land just outside Lexington, near the bend where the Kentucky River curls like a sickle. The main house was white-columned and proud, built by Eleanor's grandfather in 1820, when Kentucky still felt like the edge of the frontier. By the time Eleanor was born in 1842, the estate was the envy of the county. The colonel was a man of reputation, church elder, slave owner, tobacco broker, the kind of man who believed God favored him because he'd earned it. Eleanor grew up in that house like a flower under glass. Her mother had died in childbirth when Eleanor was 3, and after that the colonel raised her with the same iron hand he used to run his fields. She was taught to embroider, to play the piano, to speak French with the tutor who came twice a week from Lexington. She was beautiful in the way Southern daughters were supposed to be, pale skin, dark hair, soft voice. She smiled when she was told to smile. She never asked questions, she never raised her voice, and she never ever stepped out of line. Until the summer of 1860, when everything changed. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 22 years old, hired on as a field hand in May when the planting season came around. He wasn't a slave. The colonel kept 12 enslaved men and women on the property, but Thomas was a free laborer, an Irishman who'd come down from Ohio looking for work. He had red hair and freckles across his nose, and a way of looking at things like he saw more than what was in front of him. Eleanor noticed him the first week he arrived, though she would never have admitted it. Not then. They spoke for the first time in July, near the edge of the tobacco fields. She'd been walking back from the spring house with a basket of butter and eggs, and he was mending a fence post near the road. He tipped his hat, she nodded, and that should have been the end of it. But the next day, he was there again, and the day after that. Small conversations, nothing improper, just words. But words were enough. By August, they were meeting in secret, behind the old stone well at the north end of the property, or in the shadow of the sycamore grove, where the field hands took their midday rest. Eleanor had never felt anything like it before. Not the stolen kisses, not the way he made her laugh, but the way he listened. Like she was a person, not a portrait. Like her thoughts mattered. Like she mattered. It didn't last. One of the house servants, a woman named Judith, who'd worked for the colonel since Eleanor was a child, saw them one evening in late September, holding hands near the barn. Judith said nothing to Eleanor, but she went straight to the colonel. The next morning, Thomas Reed was gone. The colonel told Eleanor he'd been dismissed for theft. 2 days later, a boy from town came running to the house, saying they'd found a body in the river. Drowned, they said, caught in the current near the rapids. But when they pulled him out, there was a gash on the back of his head the size of a horse's hoof. The coroner ruled it an accident. No investigation, no questions. The colonel paid for the burial in the paupers' cemetery outside town, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't. By October, Eleanor knew she was pregnant. She tried to hide it, wore loose dresses, skipped meals, stayed in her room as much as she could, but by December there was no hiding it anymore. The colonel saw. And when he confronted her, she didn't lie. She told him the truth. She told him about Thomas. She told him she'd loved him. She told him she didn't care what anyone thought. That was the mistake. The colonel didn't shout. He didn't strike her. He simply looked at her with the kind of cold, quiet rage that made her blood freeze, and he said, You've disgraced this family. You've disgraced yourself, and you've disgraced God. You'll have that child in silence, and when it's born, we'll decide what becomes of it. But you will not be seen, you will not be heard, and if you speak one word of this to anyone, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your days. He locked her in the upstairs bedroom first, kept her there for 2 weeks, with Judith bringing her meals twice a day and emptying her chamber pot. But Eleanor didn't stay quiet. She screamed. She pounded on the door. She threatened to tell the minister, the neighbors, anyone who would listen. And when the colonel realized she wouldn't break, he made a different choice. On the night of January 14th, 1861, he dragged her out of the house in her nightgown and bare feet, across the frozen yard, and into the tobacco barn at the edge of the property. It was 20 degrees outside. The wind was howling through the valley like something alive. Eleanor fought him every step of the way, but he was stronger. He shoved her inside, slammed the door, and wrapped the chains around the handles. And then he stood there in the cold, and he said to the men who'd helped him, 2 of his overseers and his brother-in-law from town, "No one goes near this barn, no one opens that door, not until I say so." And they obeyed, because that's what men did in Kentucky in 1861. They obeyed. Inside the barn, Eleanor was alone. The floor was covered in old straw and tobacco stalks. There were gaps in the walls where the wind cut through like knives. She had no blanket, no food, no water, just the cold and the dark and the sound of her own breathing. She pounded on the door until her hands bled. She screamed until her voice gave out. And when no one came, she curled up in the corner and wept. But she didn't give up. Not yet. That night, something happened. Something the neighbors would talk about for the next 50 years. They said they saw smoke rising from the barn, even though there was no fire. They said they heard sounds. Screaming, yes, but also something else. Something they couldn't explain. And in the morning, when the colonel went to check on her, the door was open. The chains were still wrapped around the handles, but the bolt had been torn clean out of the wood. And inside, the barn was empty. Eleanor was gone. The colonel searched the property, sent men into the woods, down to the river, into town, but they never found her. Not alive, anyway. And they never found the child. Years later, 10, maybe 15, when the war was over and Reconstruction had begun, a group of Union soldiers clearing land near the estate found something buried in the ruins of the old barn. A locket. Gold, with 2 strands of hair inside, one golden, one white as ash. The barn was never rebuilt. The ground where it stood refused to grow anything. Not tobacco, not grass, not even weeds. The Whitmore estate fell into ruin after the colonel died in 1867, and the land was sold off piece by piece. But the story remained, and it grew. They said afterward, "Every sin buried in silence comes back to breathe through our children." And the South remembers, even when the living try to forget. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The truth about what happened that night didn't come out all at once. It came in pieces, scattered across years and generations, buried under lies that people told themselves because the real story was too ugly to say out loud. But I'll tell you what really happened. Not the legend, not the ghost story. The truth. Let's go back to November 1860, 2 months before they locked Eleanor in that barn. 2 months before Thomas Reed's body was pulled from the Kentucky River. Because that's where the real story begins. Not with chains and smoke and disappearances, but with love. And with the kind of hatred that only comes from fear. Thomas Reed wasn't supposed to be on the Whitmore estate. He'd come down from Cincinnati in the spring, looking for work after his father died, and left the family with nothing but debt. He was Irish Catholic in a county that didn't trust either. But he was strong, and he worked hard, and the colonel needed hands in the tobacco fields, so he hired him. 20 cents a day plus meals, no housing. Thomas slept in a boarding house in town with the other laborers, men who drank too much and fought over cards and never stayed longer than a season. But Thomas was different. He saved his money. He didn't drink. And he had a habit of reading. Novels, newspapers, whatever he could get his hands on. The other men mocked him for it, but he didn't care. He wanted more than a life bent over in the tobacco rows. He wanted land, a family, a future. Eleanor saw that in him. Or maybe she just saw herself, another person trapped in a life someone else had chosen. They didn't plan to fall in love. It happened slowly, the way dangerous things always do. A conversation near the well, a shared joke, a look that lasted too long. By late summer, they were meeting every evening after supper when the colonel was in his study and the house servants had gone to their quarters. Eleanor would slip out through the back door and walk down to the sycamore grove, where Thomas would be waiting with wildflowers he'd picked from the roadside. They talked about everything, about his life in Cincinnati, about her mother, who she barely remembered, about what it felt like to be trapped in a place where everyone knew your name, but no one really saw you. Thomas told her she was the smartest person he'd ever met. Eleanor told him she'd never felt like a person before, just a role, a daughter, a possession. By September, they were planning to leave. Thomas had saved $40. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them to Ohio, where they could marry and start over. Eleanor knew the colonel would never forgive her, but she didn't care anymore. She'd spent her whole life being afraid of disappointing him. And where had it gotten her? Locked in a house like a canary in a cage, waiting for him to decide who she'd marry and how she'd live and what she'd become. She wanted to choose, just once. She wanted to choose. They set the date for October 1st. Thomas would rent a wagon. Eleanor would pack a small bag, just clothes, a little money she'd saved from household accounts, and the locket her mother had left her. They'd leave at dawn, before anyone noticed. By the time the colonel realized she was gone, they'd be halfway to Cincinnati, but they never made it. On September 28th, 3 days before they were supposed to leave, Judith, the house servant who'd worked for the Whitmores since Eleanor was a child, saw them together. She was coming back from the spring house at dusk and spotted them near the barn, holding hands, talking in low voices. Judith didn't say anything to them. She just turned around and walked straight to the main house, straight to the colonel. Judith wasn't cruel, but she was practical. She'd been enslaved for 30 years before the colonel bought her freedom in 1855, and she knew better than anyone that survival meant loyalty to the man who held the power. If the colonel found out she'd known about Eleanor and Thomas and hadn't told him, she'd lose her position. Maybe worse, so she told him everything, and the colonel listened with that cold, calculating silence that Eleanor had learned to fear more than his anger. The next morning, Thomas didn't show up for work. The overseer said he'd been dismissed for theft. No one questioned it. Men like Thomas, landless, rootless, with no family to vouch for them, disappeared all the time. The other laborers assumed he'd moved on to another farm, or maybe gone back to Ohio, but Eleanor knew better. She waited for him that evening at the sycamore grove, but he never came. She waited the next evening too, and the one after that. And when a boy from town came running to the house on October 2nd, saying they'd found a body in the river, Eleanor didn't need to hear the name, she already knew. The official story was that Thomas Reed had drowned, caught in the current near the rapids, but when they pulled him out, there was a wound on the back of his head, a deep gash, like something heavy had struck him. The coroner ruled it an accident, said he must have slipped on the rocks and hit his head before falling in. But Eleanor knew the truth. She knew her father. And she knew what he was capable of. She never said it out loud, not then. Because what good would it do? Who would believe her? Who would care? Thomas was nobody. An Irish laborer with no family, no land, no name that mattered. And the colonel was a respected man, a church elder, a landowner, a pillar of the community. If Eleanor accused him, she'd be the one who suffered. So she stayed silent. And the silence ate her alive. By late October, she knew she was pregnant. She tried to hide it, wore loose dresses, avoided mirrors, stayed in her room as much as possible. But by December, there was no hiding it anymore. Her body betrayed her. And when the colonel finally confronted her, she didn't lie. She told him the truth, all of it, about Thomas, about the baby, about the plan to leave. She told him she'd loved Thomas, that she still loved him, that she didn't care what anyone thought, and that was her mistake. Because the colonel didn't see a daughter, he saw a scandal, a stain on the family name, a problem that needed to be erased. He told her she'd have the baby in secret, and afterward they'd decide what to do with it. He locked her in the upstairs bedroom and told the neighbors she'd gone to stay with relatives in Virginia. For 2 weeks, she was a prisoner in her own home. Judith brought her meals twice a day and emptied her chamber pot, but she didn't speak to her, didn't look at her. Eleanor screamed, she pounded on the door, she begged to be let out, but no one came. And then, on the night of January 14th, 1861, the colonel made a different decision. He dragged her out of the house in the middle of the night, across the frozen yard, and into the tobacco barn. He locked the door, wrapped the chains around the handles, and walked away. And he told the men who helped him, his overseers, his brother-in-law, that no one was to go near that barn. Not until he said so. But here's what the legend doesn't tell you. Here's what the neighbors didn't see. That night after the colonel left, someone else came to the barn. Someone who'd been watching. Someone who'd been waiting. Judith. She'd seen what the colonel had done, and for the first time in 30 years she made a choice that wasn't about survival. She made a choice about mercy. She went to the barn with a lantern, a blanket, and a piece of bread she'd hidden from the kitchen. She didn't have a key to the chains, but she knew how to work the bolt loose from the inside. She'd watched the colonel's men repair that door a dozen times. It took her an hour working in the freezing cold, but she got it open. Eleanor was curled up in the corner, barely conscious. Her hands were bleeding from pounding on the door. Her lips were blue. Judith wrapped the blanket around her and helped her to her feet, and she said very quietly, "You have to go. Now. Before he comes back." Eleanor could barely stand, but Judith held her up, and together they walked out of that barn and into the night. That's the truth. That's what really happened. Eleanor didn't vanish. She didn't die. She escaped, with Judith's help. And the next morning, when the colonel came to check on her and found the barn empty, he didn't call for a search party. He didn't alert the authorities, because that would mean admitting what he'd done. So instead, he told everyone she'd run off in the night, and he let the rumors grow. Let people whisper about smoke and strange sounds and cursed ground, because a ghost story was easier to live with than the truth. Eleanor walked through the woods that night, following the river north. She had no money, no food, no plan, just the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her. She walked until dawn, until her feet bled and her body gave out. And when she finally collapsed near the edge of a small settlement just outside Lexington, she was found by a woman named Ada Brennan, a midwife, a widow, and someone who knew better than to ask too many questions. Ada took Eleanor in, gave her food, a bed, a place to heal. And 6 weeks later, on a cold February morning, Eleanor gave birth to a baby girl. She was small, but healthy. She had dark hair and pale skin, and her father's eyes. Eleanor held her for 3 hours, crying, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep, and then she made the hardest decision of her life. She asked Ada to find the baby a home, a family who could give her a future that Eleanor couldn't, because Eleanor had nothing, no money, no name, no protection. And she knew that if the colonel ever found her, if he ever found the child, he'd destroy them both, so she let her go. And she never saw her again. That baby grew up in a farmhouse 20 miles away, raised by a couple who couldn't have children of their own. They named her Grace Brennan. She never knew who her real mother was, never knew about the barn, or the chains, or the man who drowned in the river. She grew up safe, loved, free. And Eleanor? She stayed with Ada for a few months, working as a helper in exchange for room and board. By spring, she'd saved enough to buy a ticket on a riverboat heading west. She went to St. Louis, changed her name, started over. She never came back to Kentucky, never spoke of the Whitmores again. She lived until 1891, 30 years after that night. She worked as a seamstress, never married and never had another child, but she survived. And that, in its own way, was justice. The locket they found in the ruins years later, that was real. Eleanor had dropped it the night she escaped, in the chaos and the cold. The 2 strands of hair inside, one golden, one white, were hers and her mother's. A reminder of the women who came before her, women who'd also been trapped, who'd also suffered, but who'd also, in the end, found a way to breathe. The South remembers. But it doesn't always remember the truth. It remembers the stories people can live with. And for 100 years, the story of Eleanor Whitmore was a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a legend about sin and punishment and the price of disobedience. But the real story, the one I'm telling you now, is about something else. It's about a woman who refused to disappear, even when they tried to bury her alive. The thing about secrets is that they don't just disappear when you bury them. They rot, they seep into the soil, and years later, they grow into something else entirely. Something twisted and poisonous that spreads through generations, like a disease you can't cure. That's what happened to the Whitmore family, and to Judith, and to the land itself. Because what the Colonel did that winter didn't just destroy Eleanor's life, it destroyed everyone who touched it. Let me tell you what happened next. Not the legend. Not the ghost story. The part nobody talks about. The part that's harder to swallow than smoke and chains and empty barns. After Eleanor escaped, the Colonel told everyone she'd run off in the night, distraught, unstable, suffering from what he called female hysteria. He said she'd been acting strange for weeks, that he'd tried to help her, but she was beyond reason. The neighbors nodded and clucked their tongues and said what a shame it was, what a tragedy. No one questioned him. No one asked why a 19-year-old girl would run away in the dead of winter with no coat, no money, no plan. Because questioning the Colonel meant questioning the order of things. And in Kentucky in 1861, that was something people didn't do. The war came 3 months later, and everyone had bigger problems to worry about. Kentucky tried to stay neutral, but neutrality was a lie. Families split. Brothers fought brothers. The Whitmore estate sat right on the edge of the conflict, too close to Union territory to feel safe, too deep in slave country to be trusted by the North. The Colonel kept his head down, kept producing tobacco, kept his enslaved workers in line, but the war changed him, or maybe it just revealed what had always been there. By 1863, the Colonel was drinking, heavily. He'd always been a hard man, but now he was cruel in ways that made even his overseers uncomfortable. He beat his workers for minor infractions. He stopped going to church. He stopped speaking to his brother-in-law, the man who'd helped him chain Eleanor in the barn. People in town started avoiding him, started crossing the street when they saw him coming. And when the war ended in 1865 and the enslaved men and women on the Whitmore estate were finally freed, most of them left without a word. Just walked off the property and never looked back. Except Judith. She stayed. Not because she owed him anything, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she knew something the Colonel didn't. She knew Eleanor had survived, and she wanted to make sure he never found out. Judith had helped Eleanor that night because it was the right thing to do, but it was also dangerous. If the Colonel ever discovered what she'd done, he'd have killed her. No trial, no questions. Just a body in the river, same as Thomas Reed. So Judith stayed close, kept her mouth shut, watched him fall apart piece by piece, and she waited. The Colonel died in 1867. Heart failure, the doctor said. But Judith knew better. She'd seen the way he drank, the way he woke up screaming in the middle of the night, the way he'd stand at the window of his study, staring out at the barn or what was left of it, like he was waiting for something to come crawling out of the ruins. Guilt didn't kill him, but it helped. After he died, the estate went to his younger brother, a man named William Whitmore, who'd never wanted anything to do with the tobacco business. William sold off the land piece by piece. The main house was bought by a merchant from Lexington, who turned it into a boarding house. The fields were parceled out to sharecroppers, and the barn was left to rot. No one wanted to rebuild it. No one wanted to touch it. Because by then, the stories had taken root. The neighbors said the ground was cursed, said nothing would grow there, said you could still hear sounds at night if you got too close. It wasn't true, of course. The ground wasn't cursed. It was just exhausted. Decades of tobacco farming without crop rotation had stripped the soil of nutrients. That's why nothing grew. But people didn't want a scientific explanation. They wanted something that made sense of the horror. They wanted a reason to believe that what the Colonel had done mattered, that it had consequences. So they invented a ghost story, and the ghost story became the truth. Judith lived until 1880. She never married, never had children. She worked as a housekeeper in Lexington and saved every penny she earned. And when she died, she left her savings, $300, a fortune for a woman like her, to a church fund that helped young women in trouble. Women who were pregnant and unmarried, Women who had nowhere to go. She never told anyone why, but the minister who administered the fund said she'd left a note with the money. It said, "For the ones who need a door opened." That was Judith's way of making peace, not with the colonel, not with God, but with herself. Now let me tell you about Grace, Eleanor's daughter, the baby who was raised 20 miles away by a couple who loved her and gave her the life Eleanor couldn't. Grace grew up never knowing where she came from. She was told her mother had died in childbirth, a common enough story back then. She believed it. Why wouldn't she? She had a good life. A kind father who taught her to read, a mother who taught her to sew, a small farm where she helped with the chickens and the garden. She was happy, and maybe that was enough. But the truth has a way of finding you, even when you're not looking for it. In 1885, when Grace was 24 years old, she married a man named Henry Calloway, a schoolteacher from Lexington. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, not far from where the old Whitmore estate had been. By then, the main house was gone, burned down in a fire in 1878. The fields had been swallowed by kudzu and scrub brush. The only thing left was the foundation of the barn, a dark square of earth that still refused to grow anything. Grace had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Lexington had. The legend of Eleanor Whitmore, the girl who disappeared in the middle of the night, the cursed barn, the strange sounds, but she never connected it to herself. Why would she? Her name was Brennan, not Whitmore. Her mother had died in childbirth. She had nothing to do with that old ugly story, until the day she met an old woman in the market. It was a Saturday in September 1886. Grace was buying vegetables for the week, and the woman, small, bent, with cloudy eyes and hands twisted by arthritis, stopped her near the tomato stall. She looked at Grace for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "You have her face." Grace frowned. "Excuse me?" The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Eleanor, you have her face. I thought you might." Grace felt something cold slide down her spine. "I don't know what you're talking about." The woman nodded. "I know, but you should. Ask Ada Brennan. If she's still alive, she'll tell you. And if she's not, ask at the church. They'll know." And then the woman walked away, leaving Grace standing there with a basket of tomatoes and a name she hadn't heard in years. Ada Brennan, her mother, the woman who'd raised her, who'd died when Grace was 16, who'd never told her anything about where she came from. Grace went home and didn't speak about it, not to Henry, not to anyone. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the old woman's words, "You have her face," and she kept thinking about Ada, the woman who'd saved her, raised her, loved her, who'd always been just a little too careful whenever someone mentioned the Whitmore estate, who'd always changed the subject when Grace asked about her real mother. It took Grace 3 weeks to find the courage to go to the church, to ask the minister about the fund Judith had left, to ask if there were any records, any names, any proof. And when the minister pulled out the old ledger and showed her the entry from February 1861, baby girl, mother's name withheld, placed with Ada Brennan, Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She was Eleanor's daughter, the daughter of the girl who disappeared, the daughter of the man who drowned, the daughter of a ghost story. Grace didn't tell anyone, not then. What would she say? That her real mother was the girl everyone whispered about? That her grandfather was the colonel who'd locked his own daughter in a barn? That she was the product of a scandal so ugly the whole town had turned it into a legend just to avoid facing the truth? No. Grace stayed silent, because silence was safer. Silence was what she'd been taught. But silence didn't change what she knew, and it didn't change what she felt. For the rest of her life, she lived until 1943, dying at the age of 82. Grace carried that knowledge like a stone in her chest. She never spoke Eleanor's name out loud, never told her children or her grandchildren, never tried to find out what had happened to her mother after that night, because some truths, she decided, were too heavy to pass on. But here's the thing. The truth doesn't need you to speak it. It exists whether you acknowledge it or not. And Grace's silence didn't erase Eleanor. It didn't erase Thomas. It didn't erase Judith. It just meant that the only story people remembered was the legend, the ghost, the cursed ground. And that's how it stayed for almost 100 years. Until 1954, when a construction crew was clearing land for a new highway outside Lexington, and they found something buried in the ruins of the old Whitmore barn. A locket, gold, tarnished, with 2 strands of hair inside, one golden, one white as ash. The crew foreman brought it to the County Historical Society, thinking it might be worth something, and a woman named Margaret Calloway, Grace's granddaughter, a school teacher with a passion for local history, saw it and recognized it, because Grace had kept a photograph, just one, a faded daguerreotype of a young woman in a white dress, dark hair pulled back, holding a locket in her hands. Grace had never said who the woman was, but Margaret had always known somehow that it was important. And when she saw that locket in the glass case at the Historical Society, she knew. Margaret spent the next 10 years researching, tracking down records, finding letters, piecing together the truth. And in 1964, she published a book, a small, self-published volume called The Truth About Eleanor Whitmore. It didn't sell many copies. Most people in Lexington didn't want to read it, didn't want to admit that the ghost story they'd been telling for a century was a lie, that the real story was about cruelty, injustice, and a woman who'd survived despite everything. But some people read it, and some people believed it. And slowly, over the years, the truth started to replace the legend. Not completely. Legends don't die that easily, but enough that when you go to Lexington today and ask about Eleanor Whitmore, you might, if you're lucky, hear the real story. The one about a woman who refused to disappear. The one about a woman who chose herself. There's a question I haven't answered yet. The one that matters most. What happened to Eleanor after she escaped? Where did she go? How did she live? And did she ever find peace? Because that's the real ending, isn't it? Not the legend, not the ghost story, but the life she built after everyone thought she was gone. Let me take you to St. Louis, Missouri, spring of 1861, a city on the edge of the war, filling up with refugees and soldiers and people trying to outrun the chaos spreading across the country. Eleanor arrived there in March, 2 months after she escaped from the barn. She'd walked, hitchhiked, and taken a riverboat north using the few dollars Ada Brennan had given her. She had no plan, no connections, no identity, except the one she invented. She called herself Ellen Moore, a widow from Indiana, 22 years old, though she was only 19. She told people her husband had died of fever, that she was looking for work, that she had no family left. It was a common enough story in 1861. The country was tearing itself apart, and everyone was running from something. No one asked too many questions. Ellen, found work as a seamstress in a boarding house on the north side of the city. The owner was a German woman named Frieda Becker, who'd come to America 20 years earlier and built a life through sheer stubbornness and hard work. Frieda didn't care where Ellen came from or what she'd left behind. She cared if you could sew a straight seam and show up on time. Eleanor could do both. For the first few months, Eleanor barely spoke. She worked from dawn until dark, stitching shirts and dresses and uniforms for the Union soldiers who were pouring into the city. She ate little, slept less. Every night, she dreamed about the barn, about the cold, about the sound of chains, and every morning, she woke up and reminded herself that she was alive, that she'd survived, that she'd chosen freedom even if freedom felt like this, alone, exhausted, and terrified that someone would recognize her. But slowly something shifted. By the summer of 1862, Eleanor had started to breathe again. She made friends with the other women in the boarding house, Irish girls, German girls, freed black women, all of them trying to build lives in a city that didn't care about them. They taught her things Ada Brennan hadn't: how to laugh again, how to argue, how to take up space. Eleanor learned that she was good at sewing, better than good. She had an eye for detail, a steadiness in her hands that came from years of embroidery lessons she'd hated as a girl. And Frieda noticed. By 1863, Frieda had promoted Eleanor to head seamstress. By 1864, Eleanor was managing the workshop, hiring other women, negotiating contracts with merchants and officers. She was making a life, not the one she'd imagined back in Kentucky when she'd dreamed of running away with Thomas and starting over, but a life nonetheless. A life that was hers. She never married. Men asked. There were always men asking, but she said no. Not because she didn't want companionship, but because she couldn't imagine giving up her freedom again. Couldn't imagine letting someone else have power over her body, her choices, her future. She'd given up her daughter to keep her safe. She'd walked away from everything she knew, and she wasn't going to let anyone take what she'd fought for. Eleanor lived in St. Louis for 30 years. She saved her money. She bought a small house on the edge of the city in 1875. She helped other women, young, scared pregnant women who reminded her of herself. Find work, find safety, find ways to survive. She never told anyone where she came from, never spoke the name Whitmore, never went back to Kentucky. But she thought about Grace. Every day, every night. She wondered if her daughter was safe, if she was happy, if she'd grown up knowing she was loved, even if the woman who'd loved her wasn't there to show it. In 1889, Eleanor got sick. Tuberculosis, common enough in the crowded cities back then. She fought it for 2 years, but by 1891, she knew she was dying. She was 60 years old. She'd outlived the colonel by 24 years. She'd outlived the war, the lies, the legend, and she'd done it on her own terms. Before she died, Eleanor wrote a letter. She didn't send it. She didn't even address it. She just wrote it and left it with her things, knowing that someone would find it eventually. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a stranger going through her house after she was gone. It didn't matter, she just needed to say it one last time. The letter said this: "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was born in Kentucky in 1842. My father locked me in a barn when I was 19 years old because I loved someone he thought was beneath me. Because I was carrying a child he thought was a mistake. But I survived. I escaped. I gave my daughter a chance at a life I couldn't give her myself. And I lived. Not the way I thought I would, not the way I wanted to, but I lived. And if anyone ever reads this, I want them to know. I don't regret it. Not the love, not the choice, not the life I built after. I only regret that I couldn't be there for her. For Grace, my daughter. I hope she had a good life. I hope she never knew what I gave up for her. And I hope someday someone tells her the truth, not the legend, the truth." The letter was found in 1892 after Eleanor died. The woman who found it, a neighbor named Catherine O'Neill, didn't know what to do with it. She brought it to a priest, who filed it away in the church records and forgot about it. And that's where it stayed for 70 years, until Margaret Calloway, Grace's granddaughter, found it while researching her book. And when she read it, she wept. Because finally, after all those years, Eleanor had been heard. Margaret published the letter in her book. She tracked down Eleanor's grave in St. Louis, a simple headstone in a public cemetery, marked only with the name Ellen Moore, and she added a second marker beside it, one that said Eleanor Whitmore, 1842-1891. She chose freedom. That's the real ending. Not smoke and chains and cursed ground, but a woman who lived, who survived, who built a life out of nothing because the alternative was giving up, and she refused to give up. The legend says Eleanor disappeared, that she was swallowed by the night, by the land, by the weight of her father's sin. But the truth is simpler and harder and more important. Eleanor didn't disappear. She left, and that's not the same thing. Leaving means you go somewhere. It means you keep moving. It means you survive. And Eleanor survived. The barn is gone now, the estate is gone, the colonel is gone. Even the legend is fading, replaced piece by the truth. But Eleanor's story remains, not as a ghost story, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even when the world tries to bury you, you can dig your way out. You can walk away. You can choose yourself. That's what the river remembers. Not the drowning, not the chains, but the woman who refused to be erased, the woman who walked north into the unknown and made a life out of nothing but will and hope and the bone-deep belief that she deserved to exist. And maybe that's the real haunting, not the barn, not the ground, but the idea that a woman can choose freedom and survive, that she can walk away from a father who tried to kill her, a town that tried to forget her, and a legend that tried to erase her, and still live, still matter, still be. Eleanor Whitmore was real. She lived, she loved, she lost, she survived, and 100 years later, We're still telling her story, not the one they invented, but the one she lived. That's justice, not the kind you get in a courtroom, but the kind you earn by refusing to disappear. The South remembers, but now it remembers the truth. And the truth is this: Eleanor Whitmore chose herself, and that choice echoes still.